In the first episode of our new original series, Tackling Myths and Conspiracies, here on the Steam Splendor Network, we will look at a Titanic myth that is almost universally accepted these days, and we will uncover the truth behind this myth. What will we uncover? Let's find out. Welcome to the Steam Splendor Network. Most people who have read a Titanic book or watched a program on Titanic have heard the myth that when the ship was sinking, the crew's efforts to launch the lifeboats were hampered by the fact that they were unfamiliar with how to operate the new Welin-style lifeboat davits because they had never had a proper lifeboat drill. Extrapolating from the implications of this factoid, further conclusions have often been drawn, that everyone was so rushed to get Titanic ready for her maiden voyage that no one had time for a boat drill. Right down to, perhaps, the concept that White Star, the Board of Trade, or even Titanic's own officers were lax about said lifeboat drills because they were overconfident or felt that the lifeboats would never be needed. All of this has become rather deeply ingrained in the general consciousness of the public when it comes to Titanic, but as we're about to see, all of it is wholly untrue.
First, let's take a brief look at the fact that Titanic was not the first ship to use the newer style of patent quadrant lifeboat davit built by the Welin Company. Her older sister ship Olympic, which had entered service the previous June, employed an identical setup, hosting 16 lifeboats under the Welin davits. Before Olympic, it's also known that the White Star liner Cedric of the Big Four, which entered service in 1903, had also had at least some early form of the Welin quadrant davits. Thus, any member of Titanic's deck department who had served in that department aboard Olympic or Cedric on previous voyages would have had some months or years to familiarize themselves with the Welin davits operation. So any implication that Titanic's crew members were not familiar with how to work the lifeboat davits aboard Titanic for any reason is simply absurd. Now let's go back to the morning of Wednesday, April 10th, 1912, and revisit the morning of Titanic's departure from Southampton. Sailing day was always a busy scene, especially for ships with the carrying capacity of Olympic and Titanic. More passengers always meant more people to get aboard a ship, to sort out their luggage, to make sure it got to the right places, and to get everyone settled in. But there was also a behind-the-scenes series of inspections, drills, musters, and paperwork that needed to be filed before any ship could be cleared for departure.
On sailing day, 2 men boarded Titanic to oversee all of this. One represented the White Star Line, and the other represented the British Board of Trade. Both men had to be satisfied that Titanic was really ready to sail before they would sign off on the departure. Charles Lightoller, who would serve as Titanic's second officer, recalled that the Board of Trade representative, Captain Maurice Clark, had the reputation of being the best cursed BOT representative in the south of England at the time, and that he was regarded as a nuisance because he made ship's officers fork out every detail. He had actually begun his work on Tuesday, April 9th, inspecting life preservers, having lifeboats uncovered and inspecting their equipment, and having the davits tested, amongst other things. On Wednesday, Clark was back, boarding at about 7:30 a.m. Clark and Steele worked hard to ensure that Titanic was ready to sail at noon. First, at 8 o'clock a.m. came the crew muster. This took about an hour. Afterwards, nearly the entirety of the deck department had another task to see to, a complete lifeboat drill. The deck department was comprised of 66 men, including the captain and senior officers.
If you would like to know more about how Titanic's crew was structured and organized, we highly recommend the book Guide to the Crew of Titanic by Gunter Babler, published by the History Press. For the sake of this documentary, suffice to say that anyone who was supposed to know how to work with the ship's lifeboats was a member of this department. Third Officer Pittman later testified that the entire deck department was involved in the drill. However, we do know that 4th Officer Boxhall was not directly involved in the drill. Yet, one way or another, the drill would involve nearly everyone in the deck department.
The group proceeded to the starboard boat deck, opposite from the pier, and gathered around boats number 11 and 13 on the aft quarter of the deck. These lifeboats were located in second-class areas of the deck. Under the watchful eye of Captains Clark and Steele, a full lifeboat drill began. Boats number 11 and 13 were uncovered, swung out, and lowered to the edge of the boat deck. Eight crewmen, comprised of able-bodied seamen and quartermasters, were placed in each of the boats. Titanic's 2 junior officers, 5th Officer Harold Lowe and 6th Officer James Moody, were selected to take charge of the 2 boats, with Lowe taking number 11 and Moody taking number 13. Those aboard the boat tied on life belts, and the 2 craft were lowered away to the water. As the 2 lifeboats were lowered, the scene would have paralleled to a large extent this photograph later taken on board Olympic, as her boat number 9 was lowered away shortly after the Titanic disaster.
Once these 2 lifeboats reached the water, they were cast off from the falls, and then rowed around the waterfront for a couple of turns before returning to the ship and being brought back on deck. Now, under ordinary conditions, the lifeboat's sails would have been raised and tested as well. However, the wind that morning was quite strong, and it was decided to cancel that portion of the drill. In all, the lifeboat drill had lasted about a half an hour. During the maiden voyage, there were also musters on the bridge every evening at 6 p.m. An officer, a quartermaster, and 6 seamen would gather briefly on the bridge and would then proceed to the area of the deck near the emergency boats to make sure that they were prepared for anything like a man overboard type of scenario where immediate action was required. Although this didn't rise to the level of an actual drill using lifeboat equipment, it demonstrates that Titanic's crew was not lackadaisical about safety issues. Furthermore, there was also a customary at-sea lifeboat drill for the crew on Sundays aboard White Star liners, and this drill was actually scheduled for Sunday morning, April 14th. However, due to the high winds that were in effect that morning, the drill was cancelled. It was probably felt that with the deck department crewmen having carried out a full lifeboat drill at Southampton on Wednesday, there was no need to take any risks holding such a drill on Sunday. What would it have been like to work the Welin davits on the night the Titanic sank? Our team at HFX Studios recently visited the Milwaukee Clipper. If you would like to see what working similar Welin davits to those that were aboard Titanic is really like, tune into this week's episode on our sister network, Part-Time Explorer, to find out.
As an examination of the historical record shows, the story that there had never been a lifeboat drill aboard Titanic is entirely untrue. The drill held in Southampton on the morning of departure and attended by almost every member of the ship's deck department, including almost all of the senior officers and the men who would eventually be overseeing the operation of the lifeboats on the night of the disaster, demonstrates that these men were thoroughly familiar with the equipment and were ready to use the boats in the unlikely chance that there was an actual emergency. Daily musters, every evening on the bridge, ensured that the crew was ready for emergency man-overboard type scenarios that would require quick action. And finally, Titanic's crew had been scheduled to have a lifeboat drill on the morning of the disaster, but it was canceled due to weather conditions. Without a doubt, Titanic's deck department crewmen knew how to prepare a lifeboat for loading, swing it out, and to lower them away, even with Titanic's rather unusual Welin quadrant davits. Furthermore, they had performed a full drill aboard Titanic, contrary to the popular myth which has arisen around this subject in the decades since the sinking.
A special thank you to our supporters on Patreon, including DickyChan92, Dean McIntosh, Evan Fleming, Lucas Sidlowski, Bluebird Nut, Martin Cahill, Sam Forker, Mark Gegenheimer, Maximilian Metcalf, Rachel Warner Sanchez, and Snow Monkey.